Tonight, you're not scrolling or counting minutes. You're a quiet guest at the edge of a myth sitting where the light is low, and the world is doing that calm thing it does when it thinks nobody is watching. Before you fall asleep, you'll watch a missing hammer turn into a wedding plan. You'll see how Asgard solves a crisis with etiquette and borrowed fabric, and you will feel how one small object iron in the right hand can drag thunder back into a room. 3 soft details to hold on to: braids whispering, warm ale breath in the air, and a veil settling like low cloud over something that was never meant to be gentle. Something nearby keeps time, a cart axle humming, steady and obedient. And if your breathing starts to follow it, that's perfect. Inhale 4. Exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, maybe that little axle hum will remember you there. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a battle or a heroic speech. It begins with a god reaching for a familiar weight and finding only air. You might not expect the god of thunder to end up under a wedding veil, but Norse stories have a quiet talent for putting the loudest person in the softest fabric. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it at the start, braids whispering against a shoulder, a cart's axle humming like a sleepy insect, and a veil settling down over iron the way a low cloud settles over a hill. Thor wakes up to a strange lightness in his hands, the sort of lightness that feels wrong on someone who usually grips a hammer the way other people grip a warm mug. There is a silence where thunder normally naps. The bed frame feels slightly offended by the lack of weight beside it. His belt sits differently, as if it has been asked to do a job without the proper tools, which is a very modern problem disguised as an ancient one. Thor reaches, out of habit, toward the place where Mjolnir should be, and finds only air and the faint sense that the room is listening to him breathe instead of shake. It is a humble moment for a god, and humbling moments in myths tend to arrive without knocking. In some tellings, this whole incident lives inside an old poem called Rimskvida, which is a name that looks like it was carved by someone who wanted the letters to feel like cold metal. It is part of what we call the Poetic Edda, a collection of verses that survived like driftwood, and driftwood always carries a little salt and a few missing corners. As soon as the hammer is gone, Loki appears with the timing of someone who has been waiting behind a curtain for the exact second you lose your keys. Loki tilts his head and counts possibilities like stones in a pouch, as if theft is just a small arithmetic problem. He is the sort of companion who is helpful in the way a mirror is helpful, accurate, slightly rude, and always ready to show you a version of yourself you did not request. Thor, for his part, does not panic in a sharp way. He does not run. Running is for people whose feet are not famous. Instead, he does that slow internal thunder gathering, and you can imagine it like a weather front forming politely over a field. Breathe in for 4, out for 6, if you want to match the pace. A god without his tool is, in the end, just a very large problem wearing boots, and boots are not known for subtlety. News arrives the way rumors often do in myths. It simply walks in and sits down as though it belongs there. A giant named Thrym has taken the hammer, and he has not merely taken it. He has hidden it, tucked it away 8 miles under the earth, as if the ground is a cupboard, and he is tidying up. 8 miles is a charmingly specific number, the kind that makes you think someone, somewhere, wanted you to picture the depth in your mind, step by slow step, until your thoughts got sleepy. Thrym's demand is equally neat and unreasonable. He wants a bride. He wants Freya, the goddess whose name tends to open doors whether or not anyone is home. He wants her brought to him with all the bright keys and ornaments of a proper wedding, as if a marriage is simply a transaction that can be completed by delivering the right person in the right outfit. There is something almost bureaucratic about it, like an invoice written in very large handwriting. When the message reaches Asgard, It does not cause a frantic flurry so much as a collective stare at the floor. The gods look at their shoes. Shoes are dependable. Shoes do not ask you to hand over a goddess to a giant. Only the wind volunteers an opinion, and the wind is famously unemployable. Freya, when told, reacts in a way that is both mythic and extremely human. She does not consider it for even a moment. Her necklace Brisingamen, a piece of jewelry with a backstory that tends to wander into awkward territory, shakes on her chest as she refuses. And in some tellings, the force of her refusal makes the whole hall tremble. It is a good reminder that beauty in Norse myths is not gentle. It is sharp. It has edges. Loki, ever practical, suggests they send Thor in Freya's place, dressed as the bride. The plan arrives sideways, as most effective plans do, and it is so absurd that it loops back around into being the only plan available. Sending a thunderstorm in linen feels like asking a bear to do embroidery, but myths enjoy that kind of contrast, because contrast keeps the mind quietly engaged. So they begin to dress the storm. Freya's dress will not travel because Freya will not travel, so they borrow the shape of her garments and the noise of her jewelry. It is a strange kind of borrowing, more symbolic than literal, but symbols do a lot of heavy lifting in old stories, and Thor is already accustomed to lifting heavy things. The veil is placed over him. It settles like snowfall over a boulder. They add a necklace, a girdle, a rustle of fabric that keeps insisting, softly, that the room should believe what the mirror does not yet believe. There are details that myths mention because details are soothing. The way linen pulls at the shoulder, the way a brooch pins a secret into place, the way a belt changes the posture of whoever wears it. In some Viking Age contexts, keys were a sign of a woman's authority in the household, a quiet symbol that said, without raising its voice, this person controls the stores, the chests, the practical life of the home. So of course the story gives the bride keys, of course it does. It is the kind of prop that feels mundane enough to be real, and real enough to be funny when it is hanging from the waist of someone who could split a mountain. Loki dresses too, not as himself, which is already something he does without clothing, but as a maid, a companion, a bridesmaid of sorts. He tightens laces with a grin that promises nothing and delivers everything. Loki's humor is always present, but it is the dry humor of someone rearranging furniture in the dark. Thor practices small steps because the floor has feelings and should not be tested unnecessarily. He tries to keep his shoulders from looking like they are ready to wrestle the horizon. The veil does most of the work, which is comforting. Veils are an ancient technology. You put a thin layer between the world and the truth, and the world often accepts it because the world is tired. The plan does not feel triumphant. It feels like the kind of plan you make when you cannot sleep, and you start bargaining with your own thoughts. Fine, you tell yourself, we'll try something ridiculous just to get through this. The cart is prepared. Thor has goats that pull his chariot, and their names, Tandrisnir and Tangenjoster, are like little tongue twisters meant to tire you out, as if the poem is trying to lull you by making your mouth work. In some stories, these goats have a particularly unsettling yet oddly domestic feature. Thor can eat them and bring them back to life, provided the bones remain unbroken, which is a rule that feels like it was invented by someone who wanted dinner to come with instructions. But we will not linger on the sharp edges of that. We will keep it soft, like the sound of hooves on a road. The goats lean into their traces. Sparks keep their own counsel under the iron. The axle hums, steady and low, like a lullaby for wheels. Loki rides beside the veiled bride, words folded small and sharp in his sleeve, because Loki's words are always sharp, even when he whispers. They travel toward Jotunheim, toward the land of giants, and the landscape does not rush them. In Norse stories, distances can be large, but the narration often treats them as if they are only as long as a sentence. Still, you can imagine the slow milestones, each one nodding as it passes, each one learning the pitch of the wheels humming. The sky looks the other way while two shapes cross a border they probably shouldn't, as if the sky is being polite and pretending not to notice. That is another gentle modern truth hidden in a myth. People often get away with strange things because the world cannot be bothered to be shocked every day. And if you're listening in the dark, you might find that thought oddly comforting, like realizing the night is not judging you for being awake. Threem's Hall appears with the kind of glow that makes you think of a feast already in progress, even if it isn't. Benches groan. The air smells like wood smoke and old ale, and the faint worry of hosts who have over-invited. A table is set, and the table looks like it has been asked to do too much, which tables often are. Weddings in myth tend to be less about romance and more about logistics, and this one is no exception. Threem is pleased, or at least he behaves like someone pleased with his own cleverness. The bride arrives. The veil dips, the keys jingle. Everyone pretends not to notice that the bride's hands are the size of small shields. Then comes the feast, the part of the story that is so detailed it starts to feel like it was written by someone who loved describing food more than describing battles. Thor, still disguised, eats. He eats with an appetite that forgets to blink. He eats an ox, and then 8 salmon, and then wedding cakes that do not have time to become stories before they are gone. A barrel of mead disappears like a rumor that finds a better rumor to become. The giants stare because even giants have expectations, and their expectations are currently being crushed under the weight of one very committed appetite. Loki, calm as ever, coughs once and explains it away with the kind of lie that is so ordinary it sounds like truth. The bride, he says, has not eaten for a week out of excitement. He might even call it sleepless excitement, which is a phrase that sounds like it should be an oxymoron, but somehow isn't. Threem accepts this because people in myths accept a lot if it flatters them. There is a slow humor here that you can let drift through your mind. The god of thunder is sitting under a veil, eating an entire wedding menu, while everyone politely pretends this is normal bridal behavior. It is almost gentle in its absurdity, and it is filled with those oddly specific touches that keep you lightly curious without waking you up. The way the mead cup is lifted, and lifted again, the way the table creaks like an old ship, the way the hall's musicians change keys in self-defense, as if music can hide behind a different chord and hope no one notices. The hall decides not to think too hard. Thinking is effort. Effort is tiring. Everyone would rather be tired in the easy way, the way you get tired when you listen to a long story and your brain starts turning it into a dream. Threem leans in toward the veiled face and tries to look at the bride's eyes. He meets winter where he expected dawn. The gaze behind the veil is not soft. It is a weather system. For a moment, there is the tiniest risk that the disguise might crack, but the story refuses to become tense about it. Loki adjusts the veil and offers another small explanation, as smooth as sliding a blanket back up over a shoulder. The veil nearly sparks. The keys make a small, sleepy sound. Somewhere, perhaps someone traces runes in their mind, because runes are always there in the background of Norse worlds, like tiny carved reminders that language itself is a kind of magic. Even the word mylit feels like it has weight. It is thought to be related to crushing or grinding, which is exactly what a hammer does. And it is also exactly what a good bedtime story does to your anxious thoughts, slowly, without malice. Eventually, in the way that eventually happens when you keep moving forward without hurrying, the time comes for the dowry. In this story, the dowry arrives not as coins or cattle, but as the one object everyone has been orbiting, the hammer, wrapped like a blessing and placed into the bride's lap. That placement is such a strange and intimate detail. The hall inhales. Linen remembers, suddenly, that it has been covering a storm. Fingers close around iron. The veil shifts. The room, which has been pretending for so long, pauses as if it might finally admit the truth to itself. And then the truth happens quietly, like a door clicking shut. Thor takes Mjolnir back. The myth in its original form tends to burst into a quick, violent resolution, but we do not need the sharpness of that here. We can let it soften. We can say simply that the situation is corrected, that the hammer returns to the hands that feel right around it, that the whole certainty collapses the way a poorly folded cloth collapses when you try to unfold it in a hurry. Tables lift, not so much in panic as in the general confusion of realizing you have been hosting the wrong kind of guest. Crowns learn to be hats again. Beams practice falling politely, the way old buildings do when they have seen too many feasts. The veil leaves first, drifting off like fog. Thunder catches up afterward, not in a dramatic roar, but in a steady, satisfied weight settling back into the world. And after that, there is the return, the part that bedtime stories love because it is all movement and repetition and gentle closing of loops. The cart rolls home, the goats pull. The axle hums again, and the hum is lower now, calmer, as if it has learned something about how to carry impossible plans without making a fuss. Loki, beside the returning thunder, is quiet in the way people get quiet when they have been talking too much. In the back of your mind, you can place a small bedtime oath, the kind you do not say out loud, because out loud would make it too official. Keep facts in one jar lost, disguise, feast, hammer labeled and steady. Keep laughter in another jar, smaller, because laughter is potent in tight spaces. When strength must hide, let ritual carry it. When truth must speak, let iron do the talking. Practice walking softly before you need to run loudly, because most of life is the walking part anyway. Somewhere in Asgard, keys jingle one last time as they are unhooked and set down, and the sound is almost too small to matter, which is why it matters. Someone folds the veil, careful and tired, smoothing it as if smoothing the surface of a lake. Mjolnir is back where it belongs, which means the world can pretend to be stable again. At least for a while, at least in the way a sleeping mind likes to pretend. The sky settles, the goats breathe. The cart's axle keeps humming, because it does not know any other song, and you do not need it to. You only need it to continue, softly, steadily, the way a story continues when it is not trying to wake you. The way a road continues when you stop counting the miles, the way the night continues when you finally let it carry you. You might not think a rainbow needs a guard, but in Norse mythology it does, and not because the colors are rowdy. It's simply that anything beautiful in those old stories is also somehow a piece of infrastructure. A bridge is a bridge, even when it looks like light. And so, somewhere between Asgard and everything else, there is a watchman whose job is to notice small things for a living. The sort of job that sounds peaceful until you realize it means you can never truly stop paying attention. If you're listening from a bed or a desk, or a sofa that has quietly accepted its role as a temporary mattress, you can tell me where and what time it is for you. If you can't, that's fine too. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe. Or don't. I'll never know, and that uncertainty is oddly restful. Heimdall is the one on duty. He stands near the shimmering arc of Bifrost, the bridge that connects the gods' tidy worry to the rest of the world's untidy weather. Some stories describe Bifrost as burning, as if the bridge is made of flame pretending to be color, which gives it a faintly impatient personality. But Heimdall makes it feel calm simply by being there. The way a lighthouse makes the sea feel more organized, even when it absolutely isn't. He is called the whitest of the gods in some old verses, a description that sounds like someone is comparing him to snow or bright foam, like he belongs to the clean side of the world. His teeth are said to be gold, which is a detail that feels both unnecessary and perfectly on brand for a divine gatekeeper, like a security badge that is also jewelry. If you picture him smiling, picture it as a very quiet smile, the kind that does not invite conversation so much as it politely declines it before it begins. The main thing about Heimdall is not his teeth, though. It's his senses. The poems and later retellings give him hearing so sharp it becomes almost silly, which is exactly the right level of silly for a bedtime story. He can hear grass grow. He can hear wool growing on sheep. It is the sort of statement that makes you pause and think about the sound of wool growing. And then, if you're lucky, your mind gets tired from trying to imagine it and decides to soften. Heimdall can see far too, and he can see equally well by night and by day, which means darkness does not get to do its usual trick of hiding things. He doesn't need darkness to sleep. In fact, the detail goes the other way. He needs less sleep than a bird. That is not a comforting detail if you are a person who would like more sleep than a bird, but we can treat it gently, as if the story is saying, there exists a being for whom staying awake is normal, and therefore you do not have to feel guilty if you happen to be awake too. You are just briefly sharing a schedule with a myth. If you linger near the bridge in your imagination, you begin noticing other sleepy details. The colors don't move like paint. They move like weather. The bridge hums in a way you don't quite hear with your ears, more like your bones noticing a distant train. On a quiet day, if there is such a thing as a quiet day for the gods, Heimdall would be able to tell who is coming before they arrive. Not because he is suspicious, but because footsteps have personalities. There's a practical comfort in a story that insists footsteps have personalities. It means the world is readable. Even if you don't understand it, someone does, and that someone is leaning on a spear or standing near a horn, watching for you with professional calm. Heimdall also has an origin that feels like it was designed to make your brain wander in slow circles. He is said to have 9 mothers. Not 9 stepmothers, not 9 aunts who all helped out, but 9 mothers in the straightforward mythic sense, where straightforward is allowed to be strange. Those mothers are sometimes described as sisters, and sometimes linked to waves, which makes Heimdall feel like he was born from a kind of foamy, repeating rhythm. 9 is a number that appears again and again in Norse myth, like a favorite note in a song. 9 worlds, 9 nights, 9 mothers. You don't have to solve it. You can just let it pass through you. If you want a modern analogy, it is like a company that keeps reusing the same password because it works and nobody has the energy to change it. 9 works. The myths keep it. At some point in the slow drift of this tale, you might wonder what Heimdall does all day besides standing. It's a fair question. Standing is heroic in its own way, but it isn't very descriptive. So imagine the small tasks. Imagine he checks the bridge the way someone checks a door at night, just to be sure it is still a door. Imagine he listens not only for enemies, but for oddities. A creak that wasn't there yesterday. A flicker in the air that suggests the bridge is in a mood. Bifrost, in some tellings, is guarded because it is vulnerable, because it is a passage, and passages are where stories like to happen. But Heimdall's presence keeps it from feeling like a battlefield. He makes it feel like a hallway with a very attentive doorman. And the doorman has rules, even if nobody writes them down in a tidy handbook. The first rule is that not everyone crosses. That was why the bridge is a bridge and not simply a pretty streak of light for anyone to use. The gods and those with permission cross. Travelers with the wrong kind of footprints don't. The second rule is that the bridge is not just color. It is also a kind of heat. Some stories imply that it burns, which means crossing it is like walking over a stove that has decided to behave itself for the sake of etiquette. And etiquette matters in these myths in a quiet way, not polite etiquette like holding a door. More like cosmic etiquette, like which beings belong in which places. You can picture the gods commuting, if you like, because imagining gods commuting is a pleasantly boring exercise. Odin crossing with his calm, uneasy leadership. Thor crossing with his loud quietness, carrying the weather like a coat. Frick crossing with the practical authority of someone who knows where the keys are. Even Loki, sometimes with a little too much ease, as if he is always one joke away from turning a hallway into an incident report. And Heimdall sees them all, hears them all, and stays the same. If you've ever watched people hurry through a station while you remain still, you know the feeling. Motion everywhere. And you are the steady point that makes motion visible. There is also the horn. Heimdall keeps a horn called Jallarhorn, a name that feels like it has a deep echo built into it. The horn is famous for being loud enough to be heard across worlds, which is impressive, but we don't need to picture it being loud right now. We can picture it resting. Objects in myths often have this double life, and used they are dramatic, at rest they are just present. A horn leaning against a stone, a strap worn smooth, a rim that catches light. Heimdall's hand might rest on it sometimes, not because anything is happening, but because the hand likes having a job. If you want a small, sleepy microhook, consider this. A horn designed for the end of everything spends most of its existence doing absolutely nothing. It just waits patiently like a very serious umbrella during a long drought. Heimdall's name is sometimes explained as something like bright world or shining, though the exact etymology wanders the way old words do. And he is linked to a sheep in an oddly poetic way in later skaldic language. A kenning, which is a kind of metaphor used in Old Norse poetry, might call him the ram or the white god, or other phrases that make him feel like a creature of alertness. That sheep link pairs nicely with the claim that he can hear wool grow. It is as if the myth is gently nudging you to think about softness, about fleece, about quiet fibers becoming thicker without anyone applauding. The world is full of slow processes like that, and bedtime is the right time to remember them. Now the scene drifts, almost without you noticing, from the bridge itself to the spaces around it, because a guard post implies a surrounding environment. There might be stones warmed by day and cooling by night. There might be frost that appears in the corners where a light doesn't linger. There might be a small shelter, not because Heimdall needs comfort, but because even mythical vigilance can benefit from having a place to put things. It is surprisingly soothing to imagine that a god has a spot for his belongings. A corner where a cloak hangs, a place where a cup sits. Even if he rarely drinks, the cup is there, patiently living its cup life. In some accounts, Heimdall has a horse named Goldtop, which is a name that sounds like someone was naming a pet and got distracted by the nearest shiny thing. If you picture that horse, picture a mane that catches sun like wheat. Picture hooves that are careful on a bridge made of light. The image is gently absurd, like a stable manager trying to make sense of a rainbow walkway. But myth doesn't worry about stable managers. Myth just places the horse there and lets you enjoy the detail. It's another small reward. You came for a sleepy story, and you get, as a bonus, the thought of a horse with a golden mane waiting patiently while the universe does what it does. Heimdall's relationship with time is also a soft mystery. If you need less sleep than a bird, what do you do with the extra hours? You could count stars, but that would get repetitive unless you enjoy repetition, which, conveniently, you might right now. You could listen to distant worlds. You could notice the tiny changes in Bifrost's shimmer, like watching a screensaver and pretending it's an important job. Except in this case, it actually is. The myth makes vigilance sound like a craft. Not a frantic, tense thing, but a practiced, settled awareness. There's a calm in that. And if your mind is a little restless, you can borrow that calm as if it were a shawl. The strangest part is that this watchman is also connected to humanity in a way that feels almost domestic. Heimdall is sometimes said to be the ancestor of social classes in a poem called Rigsskula, where he travels and fathers the lineages of different kinds of people. It's an oddly administrative myth, like the gods sat down and decided to write an origin story for why some people are nobles, and some are farmers, and some are laborers. And then Heimdall, of all beings, drew the short straw and became the cosmic genealogist. It is the kind of story that makes you picture him knocking politely on a door, entering a humble home, and taking on a role that feels more like paperwork than prophecy. Again, it's comforting in its boredom. Even in myth, someone has to handle the organizational chart. If you let your thoughts wander there, you might imagine Heimdall as the universe's quiet HR department, except he doesn't mediate disputes. He just remembers who belongs where and who came from what. The humor is soft because the task itself is soft. Family lines, names, small daily lives. The myths are full of giants and monsters, yes, but they also contain these tucked away tailies that feel like someone wanted to preserve a sense of ordinary texture. Bread being baked, a bed being made, a threshold being watched, a bridge being maintained. And maintaining a bridge made of light raises the kind of gentle questions that are perfect for sleep. Does it get dusty? Does it need polishing? Does it become slippery and the cosmic equivalent of rain? Do the colors fade at the edges and require the gods to do some sort of ceremonial repainting? There's no official answer, of course, because myths are not instruction manuals, though they often behave like they could be if you squint and ignore the impossible parts. But you can imagine Heimdall's eyes narrowing slightly as he notices a tiny change in the red band. Not alarmed, just attentive. Like noticing a scratch on your phone screen and realizing you will now notice it forever. Another tiny, oddly specific detail is that Heimdall has a sword with a name that can be translated as head, which is such a deadpan choice that it almost feels like a joke. Imagine someone asking, "What's your sword called?" and he says head with complete seriousness. It's the kind of dryness that fits this whole atmosphere. A god who doesn't need much sleep, who has gold teeth, who hears wool grow, who guards a burning rainbow bridge, who carries a horn meant for the largest announcement imaginable, and whose sword is called head. It's not loud humor. It's the humor of a universe that is slightly eccentric and refuses to apologize. As the narration continues, it can drift toward the gentle social life around the bridge. Travelers arriving, not with drama, but with small habits. Someone adjusting a cloak before crossing. Someone checking if their shoes are properly tied, because even gods in old stories have an occasional respect for tripping hazards. Someone pausing for a half second to look down at the colors beneath their feet. That moment of looking is relatable. People look at bridges. People look at water. People look at anything that promises passage. Heimdall watches them look, and he knows, in his quiet way, that looking is part of crossing. You don't just move from one place to another. You register it. Even if you register it sleepily, and perhaps, if you want to keep your mind gently curious, you can imagine what Heimdall hears in the silence between footsteps. He hears the tiny settling of wood, the far-off murmur of a world you can't name, the soft friction of cloth. He hears the way a person's breath changes when they step onto something that feels important. He hears the nervous little exhale that happens when you retry not to make a big deal out of something that is, in fact, a big deal. And if you have ever tried to walk quietly through a house at night, you know that exhale. You know the way the floorboards feel like they have opinions? Heimdall would hear those opinions too, all the way from the next world over, and he would remain patient with them. It is tempting in Norse myth to let everything lean toward its famous endings because the stories have a reputation for big finales. But we don't need that. We can keep it in the present tense of a guard's ordinary shift. The horn rests. The bridge shimmers. The watchman stands. The gods cross when they cross. The worlds continue being themselves, noisy in the far distance, quiet here at the threshold. And Heimdall, with his almost comically sharp senses, makes that quiet feel intentional, like a space designed for pausing. If your attention drifts, that's perfect. Let it drift the way color drifts in a thin curtain when the window is slightly open. Let it drift back to the idea of wool growing on sheep somewhere in Midgard, a process so slow it becomes a lullaby. Let it drift to the idea of grass growing, each blade pushing upward with no urgency, just persistence. Heimdall hears it. You don't have to. You can outsource that alertness to him for the night. You can let the watchman notice, and you can rest. And if you want one last soft thought to hold this. A bridge is usually built so people can get somewhere else, but this bridge is guarded so carefully that it becomes, in its own way, a destination. Not because you arrive and celebrate, but because you arrive and simply stand. And in standing, you feel the world settle around you. Heimdall's whole existence is like that, an endless, steady standing, a gentle vigilance, a quiet refusal to be startled by anything. The colors continue to glow without hurrying, the horn continues to wait without complaining, and the watchman continues to listen to the smallest things, as if small things deserve that kind of attention, as if the smallest things are how you keep the worlds from feeling too sharp. So the story can keep going like this if you want it to. Footstep, shimmer, breath. A gold-toothed smile that never quite becomes a grin. A horse with a shining mane waiting patiently as if time is not an issue. A mind that hears wool and does not judge it for being wool. The bridge humming in its low, steady register. The threshold staying a threshold. And you, wherever you are at whatever time it is, letting the thought of a guarded rainbow bridge become softer and softer, until it is less a bridge and more a gentle band of color behind your eyelids. Faint and warm, fading at the edges, still there, still humming, still watched over, as quietly as possible. You might not expect the fate of the world to be managed with something as ordinary as water and careful routine, but in Norse mythology, it often is. Not always with thunder and shouting, not always with swords and prophecy. Sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it sounds like a small stream and looks like a damp stone, and feels like someone doing the same important chore every day with the calm patience of a person folding laundry in a house that has been standing for a very long time. If you're listening from somewhere cozy, you can tell me where and what time it is for you. If you can't, that's fine. If you're still awake long enough to subscribe, you can, or you can simply let the thought drift by like a leaf that doesn't need an audience. In the roots of Yggdrasil, the great tree that holds the worlds the way a bookshelf holds heavy stories, there's a place that doesn't rush. A well sits there, and wells are naturally slow. They don't chase you. They don't hurry you. They just wait. This one is called Urgrabronr, the Well of Ur, and even the name sounds like it was meant to be spoken gently, as if loud voices might disturb the surface. It isn't a glamorous location. It is not a hall with gold beams. It's more like an ancient, damp corner of reality where important work happens quietly. The water is clear in that patient way, and the stones around it remember every footstep they've ever had to hold. And by that well, there are 3 figures who are easy to imagine in a sleepy way, because they aren't charging anywhere. They are sitting. They are tending. They are doing what needs doing. They are called the Norns, and the most commonly named 3 are Vergandi and Skuld, past, present, and what is owed, if you want a modern phrase that fits their mood. Some people translate them in those tidy categories, but Norse things are rarely quite that tidy. Their names feel like time, yes, but also like responsibility, or has the weight of what has already happened. Vergandi has the quiet insistence of what is happening now. Skuld has the slightly uncomfortable truth that the future often arrives like a bill you forgot you agreed to pay. The strange comfort is that these beings are not portrayed as dramatic villains or heroic saviors. They're more like cosmic administrators with excellent boundaries. They do not chase gods around giving speeches. They do not do long monologues. They sit by the well and they tend. and tending is one of the most quietly soothing actions you can imagine. In some sources, the Norns shape fate, and in other tellings, they carve runes or set the lives of people, which is a very calm verb for something so large. To set something is to place it, like setting a cup on a table, like setting a blanket over a sleeping shoulder. It gives fate a domestic texture, which is oddly reassuring. It suggests that the universe is being handled, not just happening. If you let your mind linger on the practical details, you get little micro hooks that are almost too gentle to be hooks at all. For example, the Norns don't just sit there being symbolic. They maintain the tree. They take water from the well and mix it with something described as white clay or white mud, and they smear it onto Yggdrasil so the tree won't rot. It's such a wonderfully unglamorous image. The cosmic tree, the spine of worlds, needing regular maintenance like an old wooden fence in a damp climate. The universe runs on magic, sure, but it also runs on preventive care. Somewhere at the center of everything, someone is basically doing tree skincare. Imagine the texture of that white mud. Smooth, cool, slightly gritty between the fingers. Imagine it being applied to bark the way someone might apply cream to dry hands in winter, slow and thorough, and without any urgency. You could even imagine her dipping her hands into the water with a kind of practice motion, the way you dip a cloth into a bowl when you're cleaning something delicate. Vergandi might be the one who spreads it evenly, because the present tense likes tasks that are currently happening. Skuld might be the one who measures how much is left, because the future always counts supplies. That's not official mythological doctrine, of course, but it fits the mood, and bedtime stories are allowed to fit moods. If you think about it long enough, you start to appreciate how restful it is that the biggest concepts are given the smallest tools: water, mud, hands, silence. There's also the idea that these Norns are not the only ones. Sometimes the texts imply there are many Norns, some aligned with gods, some with elves, some with dwarves, and they assign fates of different qualities, which sounds like a very overcomplicated system until you realize it as basically how humans talk about life anyway. Some people have good luck, some have bad, some have ordinary luck, and everyone likes to imagine there's a staff meeting somewhere that explains it. The Norse solution is to put it under a tree and call it ancient. Now, without turning anything into a lecture, it's cozy to remember that most of what we know about these stories comes from poems and later written sources, and those sources are like old quilts, stitched together, patched, sometimes missing a piece, sometimes repeating a pattern because the maker liked it. The Poetic Edda gives glimpses, the Prose Edda elaborates, and modern retellings tidy things up for our tired brains. But the core remains pleasantly consistent. There is a well, there are fateful figures, and there is the sense that time itself has a home dress, and that home dress is damp. From there, the story can drift, as stories should, to how the gods relate to this quiet corner. Odin, in particular, is the kind of figure who would absolutely visit a well of fate. Not because he enjoys the scenery, but because he has a lifelong habit of wanting to know more than is comfortable. And yet, even if Odin is nearby in your mind, you don't have to picture him as intense right now. Picture him as the sort of visitor who shows up early, speaks softly out of respect, and pretends he isn't nervous. Because being nervous would be admitting that someone else holds the pen. The Norns, in most moods, do not seem impressed by visitors. They are not there to be impressed. They are there to do the work. It's also soothing to imagine what fate looks like in their hands. Not a glowing prophecy, not an explosion of visions. More like a small decision being placed carefully into the future. A name spoken once, a thread adjusted. If you've ever tried to untangle a necklace chain without getting angry, you have already practiced a tiny version of what these stories suggest the Norns do. Slow patience, gentle pulling, a refusal to panic at knots. You can apply that to your own thoughts too, if you need to. Your mind is a necklace chain sometimes. It gets tangled in little worries. The Norns would not yank at it. They'd sit with it, water nearby, and work in silence. Another mild curiosity is that the well is associated with memory and what has been said. Water keeps reflections, and reflections are a calm kind of truth. If you leaned over it, you might not see your face the way you see it in a mirror. You might see it softened by ripples, edited by darkness, turned into something more mythic and less immediate. That's a good effect for bedtime. You don't need your exact face right now. You need a softer one. You need a face that belongs to someone who can sleep. And around the well, there's the feeling of ancient place names. Asgard above, Midgard somewhere more familiar, Jotunheim off to the side like a neighbor you don't invite over too often. But down here, at the root, geography becomes less about distance and more about depth. If you're tired, depth makes more sense than distance. Distance asks you to travel. Depth asks you to sink. Depth is kinder. The well doesn't ask you to do anything but look, and even looking is optional. If you want another small, mildly absurd detail to keep your attention just barely engaged, consider the idea that the world tree might rot without attention. Rot is such an ordinary thing. Rot is what happens to old fruit. Rot is what happens to forgotten bread. Rot is what happens to wooden boards if it rains too much and nobody checks them. By giving rot a place in the cosmic system, the myth quietly tells you that even divine structures are not immune to the slow realities of being made of something. The universe is not a sterile diagram. It's more like a living thing that needs care. That's why there's mud. That's why there's water. And that's why there are 3 women, 3 presences who are not glamorous, but necessary. As the narration wanders, you might begin to picture what their voices would sound like if they spoke. Not loud, not theatrical. Maybe they don't speak at all unless they must. Maybe their communication is mostly in gesture, in shared work, in the simple knowledge of who reaches for the water next. There's a kind of intimacy in that, and it doesn't have to be romantic. It can be simply functional, the intimacy of coworkers who have done the same shift together for centuries and no longer need to explain themselves. Dips, Burgundy spreads, schooled counts, repeat. It's practically a lullaby. And because this is Norse mythology, there's always the faint sense that even calm things have sharp corners somewhere, but we don't have to touch them. We can acknowledge very gently that fate in these stories is not always comforting. Yet the way it is presented quietly, routinely, makes it easier to accept as a concept. It doesn't scream at you. It just sits there like weather. You don't argue with weather. You put on a sweater, the Norns are like that. You don't argue with them, you simply exist around them. If you drift a little further, you can think about how humans in the Viking Age might have felt about such beings. Not as characters in a story, but as an explanation for why life turns out the way it does. When a ship doesn't return, when a winter lasts too long, when a child survives something they shouldn't, when someone dies in a way that feels unfair, the mind wants a shelf to put those things on. The Norns are a shelf, a quiet shelf by a well. And the well is not there to comfort you with answers. It's there to comfort you with the idea that someone, somewhere, is at least keeping track. There is even a subtle modern analogy that fits without waking you up. The Norns are like the background processes you don't need to notice on a phone, quietly keeping the system running, updating things at night when you aren't looking. Except in this case, they are the update, and the tree is the operating system, and the well is the deep storage where old choices are kept. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's sleepy enough, and it makes the myth feel oddly familiar, like ancient people and modern people both wanted to believe that chaos has an IT department. Now, the scene can shift without announcing itself, the way your thoughts shift when you're trying to fall asleep. Instead of focusing on the Norn's hands, you can focus on the well's surface. Imagine a leaf falling from somewhere above impossible, perhaps because who knows what grows at the roots of Yggdrasil, but bedtime imagination is allowed to cheat. The leaf touches the water and makes a small ripple. The ripple spreads, touches a stone, fades. That's the rhythm you want. Detail, expansion, soft humor, calm fade. A ripple is the perfect teacher for that rhythm. It does not resolve. It simply becomes the next stillness. The Norns might glance at it or not. They might have seen 1,000 ripples. That's another comforting thought. Your small disturbances are not shocking to the universe. The universe has seen things. It has seen leaf ripples and storm ripples, and the kind of ripple that comes when someone sighs beside a sleeping person. It holds them all with the same patience. If you feel anxious, you can let that patience borrow space inside you. You can imagine your own thoughts as ripples that will spread and then fade, not because you force them to, but because fading is what ripples do. And if you keep listening, the myth offers you more small, oddly specific curiosities, like the fact that the word in Old English fate becoming feels like it might be a cousin of these Norse ideas, a shared northern sense that time is not a straight line but a woven thing. You don't have to memorize that. Just feel how the sound of the word sits in your mouth. Weird word, It's like language itself is a thread, looping across cultures, tying one sleepy human mind to another across centuries. Somewhere above, the gods are doing their god things, but down here is always the same. Water, mud, tree. You might imagine the bark under the white clay, dark and textured, the clay bright against it like frost. You might imagine the smell, earthy and cool. You might imagine a quiet dampness that makes sound softer. Damp places do that. They take sharpness out of the air. If you've ever been near a river at night and noticed how your voice automatically gets quieter, you know the feeling. Urgrabrenner would make anyone quieter, even Thor, even Loki, even the kind of thought in your brain that usually shouts. And here's a small, sleepy joke you can keep if you like. If the cosmic tree needs regular mud masks, then the universe is, in some distant sense, a spa. Not a luxurious spa with scented candles and polite music. More like a practical spa, where the candles are replaced by cold stones and the music is replaced by water dripping steadily. But still, the core idea holds. Maintenance, calm, repetition, a long-term commitment to not falling apart. As the narrative wanders toward its later softness, it can circle back to the Norns themselves sitting in that dim-rooted place, and it can become less about fate and more about the feeling of being watched over by something that is not judgmental. People often fear being watched, but being watched by the Norns is different. It isn't surveillance, it's stewardship. They aren't looking for your mistakes. They are simply aware that you exist, and that awareness is quiet, like a lamp left on in the hallway, so you don't trip when you get up at night. If you want, you can imagine them noticing you, not in a spooky way, but in a bureaucratic way, which is much less frightening. A small note filed away gently. A thread placed back where it belongs. Nothing dramatic. No ominous music. Just the calm certainty that you are part of the tapestry, whether you feel like it today or not. And being part of something larger can be soothing because it means you don't have to carry the whole world in your head by yourself. The world has its own supports. The tree has its well. The well has its keepers. The keepers have their routine. Routine is a soft pillow for the mind, so the story can continue unhurried, water dipping, white clay smoothing, bark being protected from rot, one careful motion at a time. The well reflecting a little light, then losing it. Names like and Vergandi and Schooled resting in the air like old, clean fabric. A sense of time not as a threat, but as a gentle sequence of tasks. And if your thoughts begin to loosen, if they begin to drift away from the idea of fate and towards something simpler, like the sound of water, You might not expect the immortality of the gods to depend on something as ordinary as fruit, but in Norse mythology it does, and it depends on it in the quiet domestic way that makes an ancient story feel strangely close to a kitchen at night. Not a sword, not a shouted spell, just apples kept in a basket, brought out when needed, and eaten without much ceremony. If you're listening from somewhere soft and still, you can tell me where and what time it is for you. If you can't, that's fine too. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe. Or don't. I'll never know. And that feels appropriately peaceful. There is a goddess named Eikun, and her name sounds crisp, like the first bite of something cool. She is not the loudest figure in the Norse stories. She does not arrive with thunder. Her power is quieter than that, which is precisely why it holds. She keeps the apples that preserve the gods' youth. And the gods, those dramatic beings with prophecies and excellent hair apparently, do not maintain eternal vigor through sheer willpower. They maintain it through snacks. It's a humbling system. It suggests that even divinity benefits from a routine, and that routine involves chewing. If you imagine Icon in Asgard, you don't have to imagine her in a gold-beamed hall. You can imagine her somewhere calmer, closer to the edges of noise. Somewhere that smells faintly of wood and leaf. Somewhere with a shelf because baskets like shelves. Somewhere with a little shadow in the corner because apples do better when they aren't sunbathing all day. The apples themselves are rarely described in obsessive detail, which means your mind gets to choose a version that feels sleepy, pale green maybe with a soft shine, or small and red like winter berries, or golden in a way that looks warm without looking loud. You can even picture them with tiny blemishes because perfection is tiring to look at, and bedtime is not the time for perfection. The gods come to Icon the way people come to a pantry without announcing it, not begging, not giving speeches, just arriving when their bodies remind them. Odin, who collects knowledge like someone collecting stamps they don't even enjoy anymore, still has to show up for an apple. Thor, whose strength is practically a weather report, still has to take a bite like everyone else. Even the most serious god becomes briefly ordinary when he is chewing. That is one of the gentle jokes the myth offers. No matter how cosmic your job description is, you still have to eat your fruit. And because the story likes to keep you mildly curious, it implies something else too. The gods are long-lived and powerful, yes, but their youth is maintained. That means aging exists for them like a shadow that can creep in if the routine breaks. It's a very human kind of vulnerability dressed in myth clothing. It also means Aiton's role isn't decorative. She is the keeper of the system's refresh button, and she keeps it in a basket like it's perfectly normal. If you want a modern comparison that won't wake you up, it's like a household that runs smoothly because someone quietly keeps the chargers plugged in, the towels folded, the pantry stocked. You only notice the work when it stops being done. Now let your mind wander to the basket itself, because objects in myths often do more work than characters. A basket is portable. It fits under an arm. It can be carried across a bridge. It can be set down, picked up, borrowed, misplaced. It is the kind of object that invites mild trouble, because trouble loves anything that can be moved. It is also humble. Nobody writes a saga about a basket, and yet here it is, quietly holding up the gods' faces. A basket doesn't boast. It just holds. It is, in its own sleepy way, a perfect symbol for maintenance. If the tale kept only to this calm rhythm basket, shelf, chewing, quiet immortality maintenance, it would already be perfect for sleep. But Norse stories tend to lean gently into inconvenience, because inconvenience creates motion, and motion creates more details for you to drift through. So sooner or later, Loki wanders near the fruit, because Loki wanders near anything essential, like a cat wandering near a glass you absolutely need not to spill. Loki is not always evil in a simple way. He is more like a walking invitation for the story to become slightly less stable than it was 5 minutes ago. He notices the apple basket logic immediately because Loki has a talent for spotting the one small thing everyone relies on and asking quietly what happens if it moves. In one telling, Loki ends up tangled in a bargain with a giant named Nasi, a name that tastes like cold air. Giants in Norse mythology are not always mindless brutes. They can be clever, stubborn, and annoyingly patient, like a winter that returns when you thought it was finished. Jassy wants Iken and her apples, which makes a kind of practical sense in a world where youth is edible. If you wanted eternal freshness, you would go for the supply chain. Loki, for his part, approaches Iken with a story, because stories are Loki's favorite tool. He tells her there are apples somewhere else that are even better than hers, which is a polite insult if you think about it, like telling a baker you found superior bread in the forest. Icon is not written as vain or foolish. She is curious in a gentle way, and Renewal is curious by nature. So she agrees to go with Loki to compare apples, which is quietly hilarious. It's a taste test, except the stakes are cosmic and nobody has a clipboard. If you picture the world outside Asgard, keep it calm. Trees that don't rush. Moss that remembers footsteps without gossiping about them. Air that is cool but not cruel. Icon walks with the basket, steady and ordinary, the way someone walks when they are carrying something important and pretending it isn't. Loki walks with the confidence of someone who has never met a consequence he respected. And then the story offers one of its favorite tools, a giant who becomes a large bird. Nyazi appears, sometimes as an eagle, because myths enjoy solving problems with wings. You don't have to imagine struggle. You can imagine a slow shadow passing over the forest floor, a change in light, a moment of wind. The important part, for our sleepy purposes, is simply that Icon is no longer in Asgard with her basket, and the basket is no longer on its shelf. The routine has been interrupted, and interruptions are the only true villains in a world built on maintenance. Without Item's apples nearby, the gods begin to age. Not in a single dramatic instant, but gradually, the way you notice yourself feeling tired and only later realize it has been building for days. Hair that was bright becomes a little dull. Skin that was tight loosens. Someone who never used to sigh begins to sigh. It's almost comical, but it's also oddly tender, because it makes the gods feel like people who forgot to take their vitamins and are now quietly regretting it. And here the myth gives you a small, sleepy truth that keeps the mind gently engaged. Even the most stable-looking systems are really just well-kept habits. The bridge holds because someone guards it. The tree stands because someone tends it. Youth persists because someone keeps the fruit where it should be. Everything is chores in the end, and that is not depressing. It's soothing. It means the world is not held up by a single dramatic moment. It is held up by small acts repeated with quiet patience. Eventually, the gods notice what is missing because aging is an attention grabber, even when you try to ignore it. They look around, and the only obvious suspect is Loki, because Loki is the suspect you don't even need evidence for. He has the posture of someone who has done it. They insist he fix it. In the sources, this insistence can sound stern, but you can imagine it more like the tired pressure of a household that has misplaced something important. Everyone knows who moved it. Nobody wants to say, "I told you so," because saying it takes energy, and energy is suddenly in short supply. To retrieve Icon, Loki borrows something, because Loki borrows things the way wind borrows leaves. In some tellings, he takes a falcon feather cloak from Freya, which is a delightful detail because it suggests the gods have specialized outfits for turning into birds, like a wardrobe department in a theater that never closes. Imagine the cloak hanging somewhere light and soft, and Loki slipping it on with the casual ease of someone who treats other people as property as a suggestion. With it, he becomes a bird, which is the kind of transformation that sounds impressive until you remember it as basically a change of outfit with extra steps. There is another sleepy detail tucked into this part of the story that is so odd it becomes calming. Loki turns Icon into a nut in some versions to carry her back. A nut? Small, hard-shelled, portable. The goddess of youth temporarily reduced to something you could keep safe in your pocket, like a key you don't want to lose. It is absurd in the best way because it makes the myth feel practical. How do you transport a goddess? Well, obviously, you turn her into something that fits. Myth logic is often just dream logic wearing a helmet. Now let the scene shift again without announcing itself. The way your thoughts shift when you're half asleep. We don't need a triumphant moment. We can settle into the feeling of routine being resumed because bedtime loves resumptions more than endings. Imagine Icon back in Asgard. Imagine the basket back on its shelf. Imagine the apples back where they belong, not as a victory, but as ordinary. The gods take their apples again, slowly, with the relief of people who have had a brief scare and are now pretending it didn't bother them. Chewing returns. Sighs soften. Shoulders sit more comfortably on their own bodies. And somewhere in the corner, the shadow on the shelf becomes simply a shadow again, not a warning. And because the most interesting thing here isn't the plot, it's what the plot reveals. You can let your mind rest on the quiet truth. Immortality in this story is maintenance. Youth is not a lightning bolt. It is a repeated bite. It is a basket that must be kept somewhere sensible. It is the presence of a person whose job is quiet and constant. If you want a small moral that doesn't raise its voice, it is this. Always be kind to the one who keeps the ordinary things working, because the ordinary things are what make the extraordinary possible. You can also let the myth soften into a sensory question it never answers. What do the apples taste like? Do they taste like crisp mornings? Do they taste like the clean feeling behind the eyes after a good sleep? Or do they simply taste like apples because the simplest magic is the kind you barely notice while it is doing its work? Maybe the gods don't even think about the flavor anymore. Maybe it's like brushing your teeth. You do it because you like having teeth. You don't do it for the thrill. The world stays gentle because someone repeats a small action with no applause. If your attention drifts, that's perfect. Let it drift to the idea of a basket and how baskets are humble. They are woven. They hold things. They don't demand applause. Let it drift to the idea that youth, even for gods, is not an emergency, just a habit. Let it drift to the quiet image of a shelf in a corner of Asgard, half in shadow, with fruit that looks ordinary until you remember what it does. And if your own thoughts feel a little worn tonight, you can imagine for a moment that you are doing something similar for yourself, keeping something simple nearby, something steady, something quietly renewing until the story becomes less like a story and more like a soft, repeating rhythm, and the rhythm becomes less like words and more like the gentle, familiar feeling of finally being allowed to rest. You might not expect one of the most magical objects in Norse mythology to behave like a very patient, slightly smug savings account, but there is a ring that does exactly that. It doesn't burst into flames. It doesn't sing. It doesn't demand to be admired. It simply makes more of itself on a schedule, as if the universe quietly respects punctuality. If you're listening from somewhere comfortable, you can tell me where and what time it is for you. If you can't, that's fine. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe, or don't. I'll never know, and that feels appropriately gentle, like leaving a note under a cup and not checking if anyone read it. The ring is called Draupnir, and the name has that pleasant, heavy sound that makes you imagine metal being set down on a wooden table. Draupnir belongs to Odin in many tellings, which also feels fitting. Odin collects things the way some people collect tabs in a browser, not because each one is needed, but because each one might be useful later, and the possibility itself is comforting. Draupnir's special habit is wonderfully specific. Every ninth night, it drips 8 new rings of equal weight, as if the ring is quietly sweating jewelry. 9 nights, 8 rings. The kind of numbers that make your mind slow down for a moment, counting without urgency. If you've ever watched a clock late at night and felt time thicken, you'll understand how a myth can turn numbers into a lullaby. It's also oddly calming that this ring doesn't produce something abstract, like blessings or luck, but produces more ring. It's literal. It's practical in an enchanted way. A ring that creates rings is a very tidy concept, like a candle that creates candles, or a loaf of bread that patiently bakes more bread while you're not looking. It makes you wonder about the small details. Where do the new rings appear? Do they slide out from under the main ring like coins from a careful pocket? Do they arrive with a tiny clink, or is it so quiet that only a god with good hearing would notice? Do they stack neatly, or do they tumble and roll until someone picks them up? Because even magical multiplication can still be a slight mess on the floor. And of course, the first question your sleepy mind can ask is, why would Odin want this? Odin is not a god who seems short on options. But Draupnir solves a very old problem in a very quiet way. The gods give gifts. They pay Wergold. They exchange treasures to settle awkward situations. They do diplomacy with shiny objects as often as they do it with speeches. A ring that produces rings is like having a polite little fountain of wealth that never gushes, never embarrasses anyone, just drips on schedule. It's a steady, non-dramatic kind of power, the kind you might prefer when you're trying to fall asleep. Not a thunderclap, a drip. If you let your imagination go back to where Draupnir comes from, you end up in a place that is surprisingly cozy for a myth, a workshop. Dwarven workshops in Norse storytelling are not bright, airy studios with clean aprons and inspirational posters. They're more like deep, focused spaces full of heat, metal, tools, and that relentless patience required to make something precise. Dwarves in these stories are skilled smiths, and they seem to understand that the secret ingredient in magic is often just competence. It's a comforting thought. Not everything needs prophecy. Sometimes you just need someone who knows how to shape a thing properly and doesn't mind doing it slowly. You can picture a forge without making it tense. Heat can be gentle if you imagine it at the right distance. A warm glow on stone. A soft, steady breath of bellows. Tools laid out the way tools are laid out by someone who doesn't want to spend all night searching for the one small hammer. A smith's hands, darkened by soot, moving with calm certainty. In some tellings, Draupnir is forged by dwarves named Brokkr and Eitri, and their names sound like short, useful noises, like someone clearing their throat to get back to work. The ring emerges not with a dramatic flourish, but with the quiet satisfaction of something done correctly. And because Norse myths rarely allow anything to be purely serene, there is often a complication in the original story about forging, but we don't need to lean on it. We can keep it soft and domestic. Imagine that forging something that multiplies requires careful measuring. Not too much magic, not too little. A ring that makes rings every night would be a clutter problem. The gods would be tripping over jewelry. A ring that makes rings once a year would be too slow to be interesting. So the dwarves choose a rhythm, 9 nights, 8 rings. A schedule with breathing room like laundry day. Enough time to fold. Enough time to put things away. The number 9 is a favorite in Norse myth. 9 worlds, 9 nights of hanging on the tree. 9 steps before something happens. It's as if the mythology itself has a preferred tempo, and Draupnir obeys it. That obedience makes the ring feel like part of the cosmic household, not an intruder, not a chaotic artifact, a dependable object that participates in the world's routine. The ring is almost polite. It multiplies, but it does so with manners. Now imagine the first time Odin receives Draupnir. Odin doesn't squeal. He doesn't clap. Odin is not a clapping person. He likely holds it in his palm, turning it slightly, and feels the weight. Weight matters in these stories. A thing's weight tells you it is real. It tells you it belongs. Odin might slide it onto a finger, not because he needs decoration, but because fingers are useful places to store small, valuable things. A ring is a portable promise. It sits close to the pulse. It becomes part of your gestures. Every time you lift a cup, the ring lifts too. Every time you point, it points with you. It's like an accessory that insists on being part of your personality. And then the nights begin. Odin, who's famously interested in knowledge, might become interested in the ring's timing. Not in an anxious way, in an observant way. He might count nights the way some people count days until a holiday. Not because he is excited, but because he likes the structure. 1, 2, 3. The ring is quiet. 4, 5, 6. Still quiet. 7, 8. The ring sits there, innocent. And then the 9th night arrives, and 8 new rings appear, equal in weight, as if the ring has been practicing fairness. Equal weight is such a charmingly bureaucratic detail. The ring doesn't create 8 rings of random sizes. It creates equal ones. No favoritism. No improvisation. Just consistency. If you've ever appreciated a set of identical spoons, you know the feeling. What does Odin do with the new rings? It's easy to imagine him not doing much at first. Odin has the aura of someone who can stare at an object for a long time and call it research. He might place the new rings in a small container. A wooden box, perhaps, lined with cloth. The Norse world is full of chests and hoards and hidden compartments. People and gods alike seem to believe that important things should be stored properly. That's another soothing detail. Even in myth, there is the concept of putting things away. You don't leave rings scattered across the floor. You gather them. You store them. You make order. And yet the ring keeps producing. Every 9th night, 8 more rings. The box becomes heavier. The cloth lining grows familiar with metal. The sound of rings touching becomes a soft, private chime. You can imagine Odin listening to that sound the way someone listens to rain on a window. Not urgently, just noticing. It is a micro hook that keeps the mind mildly curious. How many rings would you have after a month? After a year? Would you start giving them away simply to make space? The way people start gifting baked goods when the kitchen fills up with too many containers? Gift giving in Norse stories is not just kindness. It's social glue. A ring is a particularly good gift because it carries symbolism without taking up too much room. Unless you have hundreds, in which case it begins to take up a very real amount of room. Kings and later Viking and skaldic imagery are sometimes called ring givers, and you can feel how Draupnir fits into that cultural mood. A leader shows generosity. A leader gives visible, wearable wealth. A leader creates loyalty with metal that you can touch. Odin, in his own mythic way, is the ultimate ring giver, and Draupnir is a tool that supports that role quietly, the way a good pantry supports a household. There's also a strangely sleepy irony here. Odin is a god associated with wisdom, runes, sacrifice, poetry, death, all those big, heavy concepts. And yet, one of his famous possessions is essentially a ring that produces more rings on a schedule. It's like discovering that a stern professor secretly loves a very mundane hobby, like stamping envelopes or organizing drawers. The myth makes Odin feel less like a distant, dramatic force and more like someone who appreciates a dependable system. Even wisdom enjoys predictability sometimes. If you let your imagination drift further into the ring's behavior, you can wonder where the 8 new rings come from. Is the ring duplicating matter, or is it pulling rings from somewhere else? Is there a hidden drawer in reality that it opens? Does it borrow from future rings and pay the universe back later? The myth doesn't answer, which is perfect. That time is not the time to solve metaphysics. That time is the time to enjoy the question without needing an answer. You can let the mystery sit there like a closed book on a table. It's present. It's not demanding to be opened. And because Norse mythology loves putting beautiful things in slightly uncomfortable contexts, Draupnir also appears in a moment that is, in the wider myth, more solemn. Odin places Draupnir on the funeral pyre of Baldur in some tellings, which is a detail that can sound heavy, but we can hold it gently, not as tragedy. As ritual, objects in these stories are used to mark moments the way candles mark time. Placing a self-multiplying ring on a pyre is, in a sleepy way, symbolically strange. It's like placing a renewing thing in a place of ending. It suggests that even endings are part of a cycle, and cycles are soothing because they repeat. The ring that makes more rings becomes part of a farewell, and the farewell becomes part of the ring story. Nothing is purely one thing. Later, the ring returns. Again, we don't need drama about how. Myths are full of return routes, roads between worlds, bridges of light, messengers who don't ask permission. The important bedtime detail is simply that the ring, like many mythic objects, moves through the story and keeps its personality. It is still a ring that multiplies. It still keeps its schedule. It still behaves like a quiet little mechanism in the corner of a universe that pretends to be chaotic, but is, in many ways, extremely structured. If you want a subtle modern analogy that doesn't disrupt the calm, you can think of Draupnir as the least exciting kind of magical printer. It prints rings, not documents. And it prints them only every 9th night, which is honestly a very responsible printing schedule. It is not wasteful. It does not print constantly just because it can. It prints in batches, 8 at a time. It's as if the ring itself believes in moderation, and that's a surprisingly comforting attitude for a magical artifact. Many magical artifacts would be reckless. This one is punctual and restrained. It's practically Scandinavian in temperament, which feels like an accidental joke that the myth would enjoy. Now the scene can shift again, quietly, to the way time feels when you're waiting for a 9th night. Waiting can be peaceful if you don't attach anxiety to it. The ring doesn't worry. The ring doesn't fidget. It just exists through the days, and then when the right night arrives, it does its one small job. There's something to learn from that if you want it. Not as a lesson, but as a mood. You don't have to produce something every moment to be valuable. You can have a rhythm. You can have a schedule. You can have quiet nights where nothing happens. The universe, according to this ring, respects quiet nights. Imagine Odin in a hall, not necessarily Valhalla with its famous noise, but somewhere more private, a smaller room with a simple table, a cup, a candle, perhaps a stack of items that only Odin cares about, a feather, a small carved token, a piece of wood with runes scratched into it. Draupnir sits there too, unassuming. Odin might touch it absent-mindedly as he thinks. He might roll it between finger and thumb, feeling the cool metal. And in that tactile detail, the story becomes very cozy. The world of gods becomes a world of hands and objects, like your world. Hands and objects are familiar. They don't demand excitement. They are good for sleep. And perhaps, somewhere in the background, you can feel the cultural reality that rings mattered. Arm rings, finger rings, gold and silver spirals, objects that signaled status and connection. They were wealth you could wear, wealth that traveled with you, wealth that didn't need a bank. Draupnir, in that context, is like the mythic exaggeration of a very real idea, portable value. But again, we don't have to be formal about it. We can just let the thought drift by and settle. The Norse world liked things you could hold. It liked tangible signs. It liked metal, wood, stone. Even its magic often arrives in material form. Now let your attention fall onto the phrase every 9th night again, because repeating it is soothing. Every 9th night, it's like a refrain, it's like a gentle metronome. If you're awake, you can count to 9 slowly in your mind, and it will feel like a small ritual that doesn't require belief, just patience. 1, 2, 3. Your body doesn't have to do anything special. It just has to exist while numbers pass, and then 9. And after 9, 8 rings. 8 is smaller than 9, which is interesting. The ring gives fewer than it waits. It waits longer than it pays out. That's another dry little joke. Even magical wealth has a slightly stingy accountant inside it. You might also wonder what happens to the extra rings over a long period of time. Do they circulate among gods and heroes? Do they end up in hoards guarded by dragons later, because hoards are where ring-heavy stories often go? Do they get melted down and made into something else, because metal is patient and doesn't mind becoming a new shape? Maybe some of Draupnir's offspring rings become arm rings on a king's forearm, warming slightly against skin. Maybe one becomes a gift at a wedding, placed on a finger with a promise that sounds very human. Maybe one gets lost in straw and is found years later, and the finder never knows it came from a god's ring that quietly multiplies. That is the sort of gentle, endless branching speculation that bedtime narration loves. It doesn't need to resolve. It doesn't need to pick the right answer. It can simply wander from possibility to possibility, like a slow walk through fog. Each possibility is a small door you don't need to open. The comfort is that the doors exist. The story has depth. If you feel yourself drifting towards sleep, let the ring become simpler. Let it become just the idea of a small, cool circle of metal resting near warmth. Let it become the sound of a faint clink in a wooden box. Let it become the quiet satisfaction of something that repeats reliably. The gods can keep their myths and their politics and their dramatic family issues. Tonight, you can keep the ring. A ring that is not loud, not sharp, not threatening. A ring that waits and then gives, waits and then gives, as if the world itself is breathing in and out. And if you want the story to soften further, imagine the box where the rings are kept, as if it were beside your bed. Not to steal Odin's property, of course. Just to borrow the feeling of it, a small box, a lid that fits well. A gentle weight inside, not a worry, not a task, just a presence. You don't have to open it. You can simply know it's there, like knowing the nightstand is there even with your eyes closed. The ring's schedule can continue without you monitoring it. It will drip its 8 rings every ninth night, whether you watch or not, which is also a comforting thought. The universe does some of its work without needing your attention. So the narration can keep drifting, and the ring can keep waiting, and the nights can keep passing in their slow, steady way. 9 nights, 8 rings. A quiet, repetitive miracle that doesn't insist on being called a miracle. And as your thoughts begin to loosen, you can let that repetition become less like an idea and more like a gentle rhythm under the words, like a little hum. You don't have to identify like rain. You don't have to count like a breath that continues on its own until you stop noticing it at all in the story lake. Draupnir itself simply keeps going in the background, patient and unbothered, while you sink a little deeper into stillness. A ship that fits in a pocket is, in a way, the dream of anyone who has ever tried to store something large in a small room and then pretended it was fine. If you're listening from somewhere cozy, you can tell me where and what time it is for you. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe. Or don't. I'll never know. And that feels like the right level of mystery for a bedtime story. The ship's name is Skyblafnir, which sounds like it belongs to wood and wind, like a word you could tap gently with a fingertip and hear a hollow little echo. In the myths, it's often connected to Freyr, a god whose domain is softer than thunder, more like the calm confidence of good seasons and well-behaved fields. Freyr isn't always the first name people mention when they talk about Norse gods, because he doesn't arrive with a dramatic storm. He arrives with a kind of steady presence that makes life feel less sharp. which makes it slightly funny that he owns one of the most clever pieces of mythic engineering. Skyblafnir is said to be the best of ships. It can carry as many as need to travel, and it always has a fair wind, as if the air itself politely cooperates. And when the trip is done, the ship can be folded up. Yes, folded and placed in a pouch, like a very elaborate napkin. It's a delightful concept because it takes something huge and gives it a domestic ending. Ships are normally the opposite of domestic. They are big, stubborn objects that demand space and maintenance. The way big projects demand attention and then quietly collect dust when you're tired, but the ship lets you tidy it away. It doesn't linger in the harbor taking up room. It doesn't ask you to pay rent in the form of barnacles. It simply becomes small. That alone is a gentle little micro-hook. In a world where gods wrestle with fate, someone also invented storage solutions. If you sit with the image long enough, your mind begins to fill in quiet details. The ship, when it is full-sized, would have planks and ribs and a smell like resin and salt. It would have rope that feels slightly rough, sails that hold a faint memory of sun. In the Norse imagination, ships are almost living things because they carry you over cold water that doesn't care about you. People would have known the sound of hulls settling, the soft complaint of wood, the rhythmic creak that can become a lullaby if you re not worried about where you re going. And then, in the same breath, you imagine that whole vessel being folded into something you could hold in one hand. The contrast is so absurd it becomes soothing because it gives your brain something to ponder without requiring any urgency. Skyblafnir is said to have been made by dwarves, which is another comforting detail because dwarves in Norse stories often function like a guarantee of craftsmanship. They don't usually make things that are merely decorative. They make things that work, even if the work is magical. It's competence turned into myth. If you want a gentle modern analogy, dwarves are the kind of specialists you hire when you want something built correctly and don't mind that they don't chat much while doing it. They just nod, measure, and get on with it. A foldable ship feels exactly like the kind of project a dwarf would take seriously, not because it's flashy, but because it's difficult in a very technical way. And the story has that very Norse habit of being oddly specific about the ship's convenience. It doesn't just sail. It always gets a favorable wind, as if someone installed a permanent, polite little weather system that follows it around. That's such a gentle fantasy. Not endless power, not unlimited control, just the breeze cooperating. It is the same kind of quiet wish you might have at night. Not that life becomes perfect, just that tomorrow's small inconveniences ease up a bit. Your keys are where you left them. The bus arrives when it should. The wind is fair. Skyblafnir is the mythic version of that wish, turned into oak and sail. You can also let your mind wander to how the folding works, because it's satisfying to imagine the mechanics, even if they're impossible. Does the mast hinge neatly, like a careful piece of furniture? Do the ribs collapse inward like a fan? Do the planks become thin as paper for a moment, then stack themselves without splintering? It's the kind of question that invites slow, repetitive thinking, which is exactly what you want when you're trying to drift off. You don't need an answer. You can just picture the ship shrinking in stages. First the sails loosen, folding into soft squares. Then the rigging relaxes, coiling itself like a rope that finally got permission to rest. Then the hull compresses, wood folding in on itself without cracking, as if the ship has always wanted to be smaller. It's almost tender, like watching a large animal curl up to sleep. And then there's the pouch. The pouch is my favorite part, because it takes the grand mythic object and gives it the same ending as a snack. Put it away. Close the drawstring. Done. Pouches in Norse settings were real, practical things. Little leather bags for flint, for coins, for whatever small necessities you needed when life was cold and unpredictable. So imagining a ship in a pouch is like imagining an entire mountain tucked into a pocket, except the pocket is made of leather and the mountain is politely cooperating. There's something deeply bedtime friendly about an impossible thing that behaves well. If you keep drifting along this thread, you might remember that Norse myths are full of objects that solve very specific problems. A hammer that returns, a ring that duplicates, apples that keep youth, a ship that folds. It's almost like an ancient catalog of magical conveniences, curated by people who lived in a world where ordinary convenience was not guaranteed. When winter is long and roads are difficult and the sea is not forgiving, the idea of a ship that always has a fair wind isn't just cool. It's comforting in a practical way. It's a warm blanket disguised as a myth. Skyblafner also carries an unspoken sweetness. It's a travel object without travel anxiety. It doesn't suggest getting lost. It doesn't suggest storms. It doesn't suggest frantic rowing. It suggests arriving. It suggests smooth passage. In a story meant for sleep, that matters. You can think of it as the opposite of a suspenseful journey. It is the kind of journey where the road is calm enough that you start noticing small details instead, how the sail's edge flutters, how the water looks like dark glass, how the air tastes faintly of salt and distance. And if you're lying in bed, those details can become soft, dreamlike textures, easy to follow. And because you're allowed to have tiny microhooks sprinkled through, here's one that's quietly amusing. If the ship always has a fair wind, then someone in the universe is constantly doing weather coordination for it. Either the ship has a built-in wind preference, or the wind has developed a personal fondness. Either way, it is like having a favorite customer at a cafe and always making their drink exactly right without being asked. The wind sees Skyblafner and says, "Yes, I know. You like it this way. Consider it done." Even the elements can be politely accommodating in a myth, which is a pleasant thing to imagine before sleep. You might also enjoy, very gently, the fact that Freyr, associated with peace and prosperity, has a ship that is basically a perfect tool for moving people around. It's not glamorous, but it's incredibly useful. It is the kind of item you'd be glad to have in a world with 9 realms and awkward distances. A foldable ship turns geography into a minor inconvenience rather than a major ordeal. It's an object that says, we're not going to panic about logistics tonight. Tonight, logistics will behave. Now let the scene drift toward how such a ship would be treated when it is in use. You can imagine Freyr keeping the pouch somewhere sensible. Not on a throne, not under a spotlight. Maybe in a chest, because Norse worlds love chests. Maybe on a hook by a doorway like a coat, because it's a travel thing and travel things belong near exits. Maybe tucked into a shelf beside other practical items. If Freyr is the sort of god who cares about good harvests, he likely appreciates good storage. Order is part of prosperity. It's hard to feel prosperous when you can't find your foldable ship. And if you imagine that chest or shelf, you can start to build a cozy little corner in Asgard that feels almost domestic. A room that smells faintly of wood. A few objects set neatly aside. A bowl that holds something ordinary. A cloth folded and waiting. The pouch with the ship inside. The knowledge that if anyone needs to go somewhere, they can without trouble. That corner becomes a soft mental place you can return to when your thoughts feel too busy. It's the kind of mental place that doesn't demand anything. It just exists. It holds. Sometimes people ask, in a practical way, why myths put so much emphasis on objects. The answer is probably simple. Objects are easy to picture. They anchor a story. You might forget the exact family tree of the gods, but you remember the ring that makes more rings. You remember the apples. You remember the foldable ship. Your brain likes tangible hooks, and a story designed for sleep benefits from that. It gives you something to hold on to without gripping too tightly. If you want one more gentle curiosity to keep you barely engaged, think about the ship's name again and how names in Old Norse often carry hints. Skyblafnir is sometimes interpreted with elements that suggest boards or planks, which feels appropriate. The name itself sounds like a ship's bones. It doesn't sound like a poetic metaphor. It sounds like carpentry, which is perfect. Mythic carpentry. The kind that makes a ship fold without splintering, as if wood itself is more flexible in stories than it is in your living room. Which is probably for the best, because a folding dining table is already enough responsibility for most households. Now, without any urgency, we can drift into the wider cultural comfort of ships in the Norse world. Ships were not just transportation, they were status, they were survival, they were identity. They were the line between a community and isolation. You can imagine how people would care for them, tar on the wood, repairs, careful storage when possible. A ship is the kind of object that asks for attention, and attention can be soothing if it's repetitive. Scraping, patching, smoothing. That same repetitive care echoes the Norns tending the tree, echoes the way Itin's apples are kept, echoes the ring that duplicates on schedule. Norse myth, for all its reputation for dramatic endings, is full of maintenance. Skyblafnir is like maintenance made magical. You don't have to dry dock it, you don't have to worry about rot. You fold it up. That is the fantasy. A world where the things you rely on don't to slowly fall apart while you retired. They behave. They cooperate. They become smaller when you need space. Imagine how restful that would feel, not just as a myth, but as a mood. A mood where problems are manageable, where objects return to their place, where the wind is fair, where travel is smooth, where you don't have to overthink. And because bedtime stories thrive on small, slightly absurd details, you can imagine the moment someone first sees the ship being folded. The quiet astonishment, the careful hands, the sound of cloth-like movement where wood should protest. Maybe it's nearly silent, the way very well-made things often are. Bad hinges squeak. Good hinges simply move. Skyblafnir would be the kind of hinge that doesn't squeak. That's another micro-hook. The ship isn't just magical, it's well-engineered. It is the kind of magic you can almost respect, like a craftsman respects a joint that fits perfectly. The person folding it, Freyr perhaps, or someone entrusted, would do it like a ritual. Not because it's sacred, but because it's precise. You fold sails a certain way. You coil rope a certain way. You don't rush. The ship becomes smaller in stages, and the stages are predictable. Predictability is soothing. You could even imagine counting the folds, not because you need to, but because counting is calming. 1 fold, 2 fold, 3 fold. The ship disappears into the pouch with the quiet finality of a book being closed. And then it just sits there, waiting as objects do. It doesn't glow. It doesn't whisper. It just has the potential to be large again, and potential is a restful thing when it isn't demanding immediate action. You can carry it without thinking about it. You can set it down. You can forget it for a moment. A ship you can forget is honestly a very gentle kind of ship. If your mind wants to wander one step further, you can imagine the ship being taken out again, unfolding. The pouch opens. The small folded shape is placed on the ground. It expands carefully, like a flower unfolding in time-lapse, except slower, gentler, more deliberate. The mast rises, the hull forms, the sails loosen. The ship becomes itself. The wind arrives politely, already ready, as if it had been waiting just offstage. No drama, no surprise. Just the calm competence of an object doing what it was made to do. And as you listen, you don't need the ship to go anywhere in particular. That's the nicest part. In a bedtime narration, travel doesn't have to lead to a destination. It can simply be the feeling of moving smoothly through dark water, with the wind steady, the sail soft, the hull quietly cutting through the surface. You can let the ship exist as a floating thought, unhurried. A thought that doesn't demand you solve anything. A thought that just carries you the way a gentle story carries you, not toward a conclusion, but toward stillness. So Sky Blofner can remain with you like that, a folded ship in a pouch on a shelf in a quiet corner of Asgard, a corner you don't have to defend or explain. The wind stays fair in the imagination because it's allowed to. The ship stays obedient because that's its nature. And your thoughts can keep drifting from one small detail to the next. The texture of sailcloth, the faint smell of tar, the soft weight of a leather. Pouch in a hand until the details become less like details and more like a low soothing hum underneath everything steady and unremarkable. The way a perfect little miracle would be if it lived in a world that wanted you to sleep. You might not expect one of the calmest figures in Norse mythology to be associated with something as quietly practical as skis and legal promises, but there is a god who seems perfectly comfortable doing both. It's a strangely soothing combination, really, sliding over snow without hurrying, and then standing still long enough to say, "Yes, I mean it," in front of other people who also like rules. If you're listening from somewhere warm while imagining somewhere cold, you can tell me where and what time it is for you. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. I'll never know. And that feels like the right level of commitment for a bedtime story. The god is Olwer, and his name is short the way winter days can be short, not in a disappointing way, just in a clean, clipped way. He isn't usually the first god people bring up, because he doesn't arrive with thunder, and he doesn't tend to turn into animals for entertainment, and he doesn't steal the spotlight by being a walking problem. Ulr is more like a quiet presence in the background of cold weather, the kind you notice when you step outside and the air feels sharp but honest. In some old descriptions, he is a strong archer and a skier, and there's something almost comically specific about that. Not Master of Storms, not Lord of the Deep, just very good at moving over snow and hitting things accurately from far away, which is a skill set that sounds like it would be appreciated by anyone who has ever needed to get somewhere in winter without making a fuss. If you let your mind settle into the texture of that, you can picture Ulr's gear in a way that feels cozy rather than dramatic. Skis are simple objects in the end, shaped wood, smoothed edges, a little curve at the front like a polite bow. They smell faintly of resin if you imagine them close. They carry the quiet memory of trees. There might be bindings made of leather, softened by use, adjusted with calm fingers. There might be a thin layer of something like wax, because even in myth, friction is real, and the best kind of magic is often just good preparation. Ulr's bow, too, can be imagined as a piece of wood with a patient bend, perhaps yew, because yew has that old reputation for making good bows, and myths love materials that sound like they were chosen intentionally. The bowstring might be taut but not angry, the way a well-tuned instrument is taut but still musical. And if you want a small micro-hook that doesn't wake you up, consider this. Ulr is sometimes connected with the idea of oaths, and oaths in Norse society could be sworn on rings, literal rings, often kept in sacred or communal settings, touched or held as promises were made. So Ulr the skier also lives near the slow, careful world of vows. Imagine the contrast, the whisper of skis on snow, and the quiet weight of a ring under someone's palm as they promise something out loud. Both are forms of balance. Both require control. Both punish you gently if you rush. It's almost as if Ulr specializes in the kind of skill that rewards steadiness, and steadiness is exactly what you want while falling asleep. Now, without turning this into a lesson, it's worth letting the story remain pleasantly specific. Ulr is sometimes said to be the son of Sif, which makes him Thor's stepson in some family arrangements, and that alone is quietly funny. Imagine growing up in a household where thunder is your stepfather's normal tone and your own specialty is gliding silently over snow. That's like living with someone who blasts music and becoming yourself, the person who prefers headphones and gentle playlists. Ulr's calm starts to feel like a personality choice, not rebellion, exactly. Just a preference for not shaking the furniture. The scene in your mind can shift softly from Ulr's gear to the kind of winter landscape that makes his skills feel natural, not a battlefield. Just a wide, pale world where sound carries differently. A frozen lake, perhaps, with a surface that looks like dark glass under a skin of snow. Trees at the edge holding still, their branches patient. The air feels clean enough to be almost empty. If Ulr moves through this place, he doesn't need to announce himself. His skis do the speaking, and what they say is mostly hush. The rhythm is simple. Slide, settle, slide, settle. The kind of rhythm that turns thoughts into something smoother. And the more you linger here, the more the myth feels like an excuse to describe small winter details. The way your breath becomes visible for a moment and then forgets itself. The way snow can squeak under pressure in certain temperatures, a sound that feels like the world quietly acknowledging your existence. The way tracks look like handwriting across a blank page. Ulr, being associated with archery, would notice angles. He would notice distance. He would notice how far a sound is by the time it arrives. It's the kind of attention that feels restful because it's outward facing. Instead of thinking about everything inside your head, you imagine someone noticing the world gently, and your mind gets to borrow that gentleness. Then, very naturally, the story can drift toward the other side of Ulr's reputation, the slow ritual of promises. Somewhere in the Norse world, people gather at a wing, an assembly, not in a tense way tonight, just in a practical way. Think of it like a community meeting that has been happening for so long, it has developed its own gravity. People stand in cloaks. Someone's boots are damp. Someone clears their throat and instantly regrets it because the air is cold and throats are dramatic about cold air. There's an oath ring present in some traditions, a ring that represents the seriousness of spoken commitment, and the seriousness itself can be calming when it isn't weaponized. It's simply structure. The world holds together because people agree out loud to certain things. If Ulr is near such a scene in your imagination, he doesn't have to be a judge. He can simply be the mood of it, the quiet insistence that words matter. There's something almost tender about oath-taking as an idea. People trying to make the future less wobbly by saying, I will do this, and having witnesses. It is like putting a small weight on a piece of paper so it doesn't blow away. Norse society had plenty of harsh edges, but it also had this concept that public promises create stability, and stability is deeply bedtime friendly. You can imagine the ring being touched, not dramatically, just briefly, like tapping a table to show you're paying attention. The ring is cold. Metal holds cold well. The person swearing feels that cold and remembers, oh right, this is real. And here's a soft dry joke you can let drift by. If you ever feel overwhelmed by modern paperwork, remember that ancient people also created systems where you had to stand in a designated place and say certain words correctly while touching the official ring. Humans have always loved ritualizing responsibility. We just changed the accessories. They had rings and assembly stones. We have forms and signature boxes that never seem to be in the right place. Different props, same desire, to make chaos behave for 5 minutes. In some poetic phrases, ULLR is linked with shields in a way that suggests travel over ice, as if a shield could become a kind of sled. It's one of those details that feels both heroic and extremely practical. If you've ever been near snow with nothing appropriate to slide on, you understand the impulse. A shield is flat, a shield is sturdy. A shield can be repurposed. It's not a glamorous mythic image. It is a we need to get across this frozen surface and I refuse to walk if I don't have to image. Or, as a winter mover, would appreciate that kind of improvisation, and it gives the story another small, oddly specific texture to rest your mind on. The scrape of a shield's rim over ice, the way snow piles up along the edge, the little shiver of metal when it meets a harder patch. Now let the narrative shift again, gently back outdoors, because this whole episode wants to live in the quiet places between big events. Imagine Olwer leaving the assembly scene behind, not in a rush, just in that calm way you leave a room when you've finished what you came to do. The world outside is wide again. The snow hasn't moved much. The lake is still patient. He steps onto his skis, or onto this smooth idea of skis, and the movement begins. Slide, settle, slide, settle. It's almost like breathing. In for 4, out for 6 if you want, except the world is doing the counting for you now. As he moves, you can let the story sprinkle in more small Norse winter facts, the kind that keep your attention lightly engaged without making you sit up. Skiing itself is old in Scandinavia, and people used skis for practical travel long before anyone thought of it as a sport with rules and sponsorships and slightly too expensive equipment. In that way, Olwer starts to feel less like an exotic deity and more like an honorific for a skill people deeply respected. The ability to move through winter as if winter is not an enemy, just a season. The ability to make distance feel smaller. The ability to travel without exhausting yourself. That's the kind of ability you'd absolutely mythologize if your world had long winters. You'd look at the person who glides smoothly over snow and think, yes, that one has something the rest of us don't, and you might as well call it divine. And because Olwer is also an archer, you can imagine him pausing sometimes, not to hunt anything urgently, but simply to practice the calm gesture of drawing a bow. There's something inherently soothing about archery when you remove the stakes. Its posture, its breath, its quiet focus. The bow bends, the string tightens, the world narrows to a line, and then, without drama, the tension is released. The arrow flies, and you don't even need to see where it lands. The important part is the rhythm. Draw, hold, release. Like a thought rising, pausing, and then drifting away. And if you want another micro hook, consider that a bow is basically a controlled spring made of wood, which is very polite technology. No electricity, no gears. Just fiber and shape and patience. If you're worried that an archer god might pull the story toward excitement, don't. Keep it soft. Imagine the target is something harmless, like a knot in a tree stump, or a mark on a snowbank, or even just the act of aiming itself. The myth doesn't have to be about conquest. It can be about competence, and competence is oddly comforting. There's a reason people like watching someone fold a towel neatly. It's soothing to witness skill applied without chaos. Olwer's entire vibe is that, skill without noise. The snow continues to carry small details for you. The way it clings to the edge of a boot, the way it fills in old tracks slowly, like the world erasing its own handwriting. The way a frozen lake can make a faint singing sound when the temperature shifts. A low, distant note that feels like the earth humming to itself. Olwer would hear that and not panic, because he belongs to this environment. He would accept it the way you accept a refrigerator's quiet hum at night, a reminder that something is running in the background, keeping things stable. And maybe in this slow wandering, your mind notices how Olwer feels like a god of thresholds. A threshold between movement and stillness. Between speaking an oath and letting silence return. Between winter's hardness and winter's beauty. There's no need to turn that into a grand statement. Just let it be a gentle observation, like noticing the edge of a blanket against your skin. The myth gives you permission to enjoy edges without cutting yourself on them. Now the story can drift toward the end without concluding, as all good sleep stories do. Imagine Olwer returning to a quieter space, not a grand hall with feasting, but a simple shelter where winter gear can be kept. A place where skis are leaned carefully against a wall, because even divine skis should not be left lying around to trip over. A place where a bow can be unstrung, because leaving a bow strung too long can weaken it. And mythology, when it is being practical, remembers those details. If you've ever taken care of something made of wood, you know the routine. Loosen tension, wipe off moisture, keep it from warping. It's maintenance again, that soothing theme that keeps showing up. The cosmos may be dramatic, but bedtime lives in upkeep. Picture Ulver's hands doing small, quiet tasks, brushing snow off bindings, checking leather for stiffness, running fingers along the edge of a ski to feel for damage, maybe smoothing a little wax, not as a magical gesture, but as ordinary preparation. The kind of preparation that says, I will be able to move again when I need to. I won't be stuck. That is, in its own way, a promise, a silent oath to future motion. And it pairs nicely with Ul's oath-ring side. Some promises are spoken into a circle of metal. Some are spoken into a piece of wood with a curve at the front. If you want one last soft modern analogy before the words fade, think of Ulver as the patron of anyone who does quiet, competent work that nobody cheers for. The person who quietly shovels a path so others don't slip. The person who checks the locks before bed. The person who keeps things running. The person who knows that winter isn't something you defeat. It's something you manage gently with preparation and rhythm. Ulver doesn't need a big scene. He just needs the snow to be there, and the promise to be kept, and the movement to be smooth. You might not expect the greatest source of poetic inspiration in Norse mythology to begin with something as unglamorous as people spitting into a container. But it does, and the story treats it with the calm practicality of a recipe that has been handed down in a family for too long to feel embarrassed about its origins. It's one of those myths that quietly says, yes, the universe is grand, but it is also sticky, and sometimes it is stored in jars. If you're listening from a bed or a chair, or the sort of sofa that has gently accepted its fate as a mattress, you can tell me where and what time it is for you. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe, or don't. I'll never know, and that uncertainty is surprisingly restful. The story drifts, as so many Norse stories do, from a big social concept into a small physical object. The big concept is peace. The gods, in one telling, make peace with another group of divine beings, and to seal that peace, they do something that sounds odd, but also oddly communal. They spit into a vessel, not as an insult, not as a prank, but as a ritual sign that the agreement is real. It's a very human gesture disguised as myth, because humans love using objects to make promises feel tangible. A handshake, a signature, a sealed envelope. The Norse myth gives you a pot of shared saliva, which is not the most elegant version of the idea, but it is memorable, and memorability is a kind of magic all by itself. From that shared vessel, a being is made. His name is Kvasir, and he is described as wise enough to answer any question. That is a sleepy micro-hook. Imagine a person who can answer any question, and then imagine that person choosing to answer them quietly without showing off. Kvasir wanders, speaking with people, offering wisdom like a calm stream offers water. There's no rush in that image. Wisdom in the story is portable, it walks around. It goes where it is asked to go. And if you've ever had the feeling that your mind is full of questions at night, Kvasir is a comforting figure to imagine, because he represents the possibility that questions can be answered without panic. They can be answered slowly, gently, even with a hint of dry humor, as if the answer has been waiting for you and doesn't mind the late hour. Eventually, though, the story does what stories often do. It turns the wandering into an object again, because Norse myth loves a good container. Kvasir's wisdom becomes, in a later twist, something you can drink. In the myth, Kvasir is killed by dwarves, and his blood is mixed with honey to create a mead that grants poetic inspiration and wisdom to whoever drinks it. That sounds dramatic if you say it quickly, but you don't have to say it quickly. You can let it be slow, like brewing itself. Brewing is not a fast activity. Brewing is waiting. Brewing is paying attention to small changes. Brewing is trusting a process you can't entirely see. And when you think of the mead as a brewed thing, it becomes less like a shocking transformation and more like a strange, sticky form of preservation, as if wisdom is something you can keep from spoiling by mixing it with sweetness. Honey in the old Norse world was valuable, and for a very practical reason, it keeps. It lasts, it carries summer inside it when winter is long. It is also, by nature, slow. Bees do not hurry. They work with a steady seriousness that makes them feel like tiny, buzzing monks. So when you imagine honey being poured and stirred, you can imagine the calm weight of it, thick, golden, clinging to the inside of a cup. A spoon lifting and taking its time. Honey is almost the opposite of urgency. Even when you want it, it insists you wait. Now the meat itself, in the myth, is stored in containers with names that are satisfyingly concrete. In some tellings, there are 3 vessels, Agriir, Bone, and Sun. You don't have to memorize them. You can simply feel how they sound, like the names of jars that have been used so often the household stops thinking about them. The jars sit somewhere cool, a corner, a shelf, a place where the light doesn't bother them. This is the cozy part of the myth, the part that feels like a pantry rather than a battlefield. Divine inspiration is not floating in the air, it's in a jar. And there's something deeply sleep-friendly about that. If inspiration can be stored, it doesn't have to chase you. It can wait quietly until you're ready, like tea leaves in a tin. The mead, when imagined gently, becomes an object of ritual comfort. Picture a hall, not loud tonight, just softly lit, benches that know the shape of backs, a table that has carried many cups. The air is warm with the smell of wood and something faintly sweet. A cup of mead is poured carefully, not because it's precious in a dramatic way, but because it's sticky, and nobody wants to clean up sticky spills in the middle of the night. The pour is slow. The surface catches the light. Someone takes a sip, not gulping, because mead is not a drink you rush. It's a drink that asks you to notice it, and then, as the myth promises, words come easier. Not loud words, not performance words. Just words that fit together neatly, like pieces of cloth in a quilt. In Norse culture, poetry mattered. Skald poets were respected, and not because they were flashy, but because they could hold memory and honor and story in structured language. That structure is part of why poetry is soothing. It gives your mind a pattern. Even if you don't understand every line, you can feel the rhythm, and rhythm is a gentle hand on the shoulder. If you want a small micro hook tucked into the calm, consider the idea of kennings, those poetic metaphors that Norse poets loved, like calling the sea a whale road, or calling gold fire the river, or calling a ship a sea steed, as a playful way of speaking that keeps the mind slightly engaged without forcing it to work too hard. Imagine drinking mead and suddenly seeing the world in those soft, sideways phrases. Your bed becomes a blanket nest. Your pillow becomes a headstone. The night becomes a window dark. It's mildly silly, yes, but in a quiet way that doesn't break the mood. Sometimes the mind relaxes when it's allowed to be a little strange. Now, because this is Norse myth, Odin eventually becomes involved, because Odin has a strong habit of collecting anything that contains wisdom. Whether it is a rune, a story, a sacrifice, or a drink, Odin doesn't like to miss out on knowledge. In the myth, he acquires the mead through a series of events that can be told with more drama, but we don't need that. We can imagine it as a careful heist where the main challenge is logistics and timing rather than danger. Imagine Odin not as a roaring conqueror, but as a quietly determined collector. The kind of person who has a very organized system for obtaining rare items and is mildly offended when the universe puts them behind locked doors. He travels, he speaks, he persuades, he waits. He behaves like someone who knows that patience is a tool. And eventually, the Mead moves from one set of containers to another, because the Mead S story is really the story of how inspiration travels. It goes from communal peace vessel to wandering wise person, to sweet brewed drink, to hidden jars, to the mouth of a god. And from there, in the myth's logic, it spills into the world in small doses. That last idea is another gentle micro-hook. The best kind of inspiration is not the kind that arrives in a blinding flash. It's the kind that leaks out into ordinary life, here and there, in moments when you least expect it, like the smell of bread when you walk past a bakery at night. And the myth includes, with a very dry grin, the notion that not everyone who gets poetic inspiration gets the good kind. Some get true skill, some get what you might call enthusiastic nonsense. The story in some versions even suggests that bad poetry comes from the less dignified leftovers of Odin's journey. It is the myth politely admitting what everyone knows. Not all inspired speech is worth listening to. Some of it is just noise wearing confidence. That's a comforting joke because it takes pressure off. If you ever worry that your thoughts are messy, you can remember that even the gods, in their own stories, acknowledge the existence of messy output. The universe has always had drafts. Now let the scene drift back to the mead itself, because the mead is where the sleep lives. Imagine the jars again. Heavy ceramic, perhaps, or carved wood bound with metal. Lids that fit snugly, maybe cloth tied over the top, maybe wax sealing the edge. The smell inside would be sweet, fermented, warm. Fermentation is another sleepy process. It is life working quietly in the dark, transforming sugar into something else without needing applause. If you listen to a fermenting jar long enough, no need to do this in real life. Just imagine it. You might hear a tiny bubble rise and pop. A small sound. A small proof that something is happening without your intervention. That's the dream. That some of the world's work continues while you rest. And here is a soft modern analogy that fits without jolting you awake. The Mead of Poetry is like an update you don't notice installing. You go to sleep with your mind feeling one way, and you wake up with words fitting together slightly better, as if something inside you organized a drawer while you weren't looking. The myth gives that invisible mental shift a concrete form. A drink, a sweetness, a jar. It turns inspiration from a vague concept into something you can imagine touching, tasting, and storing. The Norse world was full of halls and feasts, yes, but it was also full of quiet work stirring, storing, pouring, keeping. A mead that grants poetry fits right into that. It suggests that even the most soaring thing, language that lifts and moves and remembers, comes from the same basic. Human acts, making, waiting, sharing. Someone had to keep the honey. Someone had to keep the jar clean. Someone had to decide when to open it. Someone had to pour without spilling. And if you've ever poured a sticky drink in dim light, you know that pouring itself can be a kind of meditation. Slow hands, steady cup, attention narrowed to a small stream. If your mind wants to wander into the background of the myth, you can imagine the bees again, a hive in summer, warm air, the smell of flowers, the busy seriousness of tiny bodies doing their repetitive work. Bees don't know they're making ingredients for meth. They just do what they do. That's another quiet comfort. The ingredients of magic often come from ordinary life. In a Norse landscape where winters are long and light can be rare, honey would feel like stored sunlight. Mead would feel like stored warmth. And poetry, good poetry, would feel like stored meaning carried through dark seasons. Now, because this series wants to stay gently boring and oddly specific, we can let the story focus on the smaller pleasures of a poetic world. Imagine a skald practicing lines under his breath, not to impress, but to remember. Repetition is how poems survive. A line is spoken again and again and again until it becomes part of the mind's furniture. Imagine the quiet pride of getting a phrase to land correctly, like placing a cup on a table without clinking it too loudly. Imagine the mild annoyance of a line that won't behave, the way a blanket corner won't tuck properly. These are not dramatic struggles. They're the kind of struggles that make the mind feel occupied without feeling threatened, which is exactly what sleep likes. And you can keep sprinkling micro hooks in the form of gentle Norse trivia that doesn't demand a textbook. Mead halls weren't just for drinking. They were for bonding and gift-giving and settling reputations. A good poem could earn you favor. A sharp insult could earn you trouble. Words mattered, which is funny, because tonight you don't need your words to matter at all. Tonight, words can simply be soft. They can be background sound. They can be a river you float on. If you want, you can imagine the Mead of Poetry being diluted into everyday life, like a small amount poured into a large bowl and shared so it doesn't overwhelm anyone. That's the kind of gentle distribution that suits a bedtime story. Not everyone gets struck by genius. Some people just get a little more articulate, a little more able to name their feelings, a little more able to tell a story without losing their place. That's a kind of magic too, and it's a kind of magic you can wish for without making the night exciting. And because we're letting this drift without conclusion, we don't need to pin down who deserves the mead or where it ends up. We can simply keep returning to the image of jars in a cool place. A shelf, a corner, a quiet store of sweetness. We can imagine Odin, that relentless collector, taking a small sip and then, instead of declaring victory, just sitting with it. Let Odin be still for once. Let him be the kind of person who drinks something warm and then stares into the middle distance, thinking slowly, not plotting. That stillness is allowed. Myths are flexible when you tell them softly. If you're listening in the dark, you can let the idea of poetic mead turn into a more general comfort. The idea that the right kind of words exist somewhere, even if you can't find them tonight. They can be stored, they can be saved, they can be poured later. You don't have to force them right now. You don't have to solve your life in one sitting. The Norse myth, in its strange, sticky way, gives you permission to treat wisdom like something that can wait in a jar. So the story can keep moving gently in circles, a vessel of peace. A wise wanderer, honey stirred into something darker and deeper. Jars with heavy lids, a sip that loosens language. A few good lines falling into place like snow settling on branches. A few bad lines wandering off into the night with confidence they haven't earned, which is, honestly, very human. The world of Norse myth becomes, for this moment, less about battles and endings and more about pantry logic and quiet processes. And as your thoughts soften, you can let the mead become less specific and more like a feeling. Warmth in the chest, sweetness on the tongue. The gentle ease of language when it stops trying to be perfect. The comfort of knowing that inspiration doesn't have to be a lightning strike. It can be a slow fermentation happening quietly while you rest. You can let the jars sit undisturbed in your imagination, lids closed, contents calm, nothing spilling. You can let the bees return to their work somewhere far away in a summer you don't have to reach right now. You can let the Vizier keep wandering, answering questions you're too sleepy to ask. And you can let Odin, for once, stop chasing knowledge and simply sit with a cup in his hands, listening to the quiet of the hall, the soft settling of wood, the faint, patient hum of a world that continues without demanding your attention. So there doesn't have to be an ending. The mead can remain in its jar. The jar can remain on its shelf. The shelf can remain in a dim corner of a mythic world that doesn't mind if you drift away mid-sentence. Words can keep forming somewhere in the background, like bubbles rising in a fermenting bowl, small and quiet and inevitable. And you can let your own mind do the same, working softly, transforming the day into something less sharp until the story feels like it's moving farther away, not because it's finished, but because you no longer need to hold it, and the night, like honey, like mead, like a well-kept jar of gentle inspiration, simply holds you instead.